Good morning, friends. Now we are going to learn the next part of module number 4, that is third term, that is paradox. How it is used in literature and why it is used for the criticism. A paradox is a statement that appears at first to be contradictory, but upon reflection then makes sense. This literary device is commonly used to engage a reader to discover an underlying logic in a seemingly self contradictory statement or phrase. As a result, paradox allows readers to understand concepts in a different and even non traditional way. For example, we can see playwright George Bernard Shaw famously stated the paradox that youth is wasted on the young. At first, it is contradictory in the sense that the young are the ones that embody youth. So therefore cannot be wasted on them. However, this paradox makes sense upon reflection. It illuminates the idea that young people may not have the perspective of older people as far as what is truly important or valuable. Youth in this case implies a vibrancy and energy that can be put towards those very actions that are important and valuable. Yet, young people may not recognize what they are, whereas older people, who may recognize which actions have importance or value, often don't feel such vitality or willingness to take risks to do them. As a result, the very group who would benefit from youth due to their perspective are the ones who, by definition, aren't youthful. There are some common examples of paradox. There are many common examples of paradox in everyday conversation and writing. Here are some well known and familiar uses of this literary device. Less is more is one of the example of paradox, the beginning of the end. Earn money by spending it. The pen is mightier than the sword. The more you give, the more you get. Impossible is not a word in my vocabulary. Examples of paradox in movies. We can see examples of paradox in movies also. Often portrayed in movies as well through dialogues or situations. This creates humor and or causes the audience to think and gather greater meaning from a film. So here are some example of paradox in movies, that is Disney's The Incredibles, that if everyone is special, no one is. Example from Fight Club, that is the first rule about Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule about Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. So it is a repetition and creating a paradox. From next example is from The Godfather. I am going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Famous examples of paradox is also found in many examples of poetry, prose, drama, lyrics, and clever quotations. Here are some famous examples of paradox. I can't live with or without you. Men work together, whether they work together or apart. It is from Robert Frost. Next example, I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody to Emily Dickinson's? Next is about what is the difference between paradox and oxymoron. There are some examples from also Catch 22, Hamlet, As I, I lay dying. Again, we can read about the writing paradox, that is, as a literary device. Paradox functions as a means of setting up a situation, idea, or concept that appears on the surface to be contradictory or impossible. However, with further thought, understanding, or reflection, the conflict is resolved due to the discovery of an underlying level of reason or logic. This is effective in that a paradox creates interest and a need for resolution on the part of the reader for understanding. This allows the reader to invest in a literary work as a means of deciphering the meaning of the paradox. It's important for writers to construct proper paradox so that the meaning is not lost for the reader. Paradox is dependent upon two elements, a statement or a situation which initially appears contradictory, and second one, the statement or situation that appears contradictory must, after consideration, be a logical or well founded premise. Here are examples, some ways that writers benefit from incorporating metaphor into the work. Set up conflict, create irony. That is, set up conflict with paradox is an excellent literary device as a means of setting up conflict in a work of literature. A paradoxical situation or idea in a literary work creates tension and potential suspense for the reader. For example, a literary character may find themselves in a situation where they must go against law and order as a means of preserving law and order. This type of paradox generates interest for the reader in terms of anticipating the resolution of the conflict. So, next is about create irony. Paradox is a way for writers to create verbal or situational irony. In a broad sense, irony itself is a literary device in which what appears to be said, expected, or talking or taking place on the surface of literary work is very different from what is actually the case. Paradox often creates irony in literature, which can deepen the meaning for the reader through humor or a sense of realism due to the complexity and often contradictory ways in which humans behave. Examples of paradox in literature, that is, paradox is an effective literary device as a means of creating interest in a literary work and engendering thought on the part of the reader. Here are some examples of paradox and how it adds to the significance of well known literary works. First example is of Catch 22, the novel by Joseph Heller. There was only one catch, and that was Catch 22, which specified that a concern for one's safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask, and as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions, or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't, but if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to, but if he didn't want to, he was sane and had to. So, here is the example of Catch 22. Next example, Hamlet. I must be cruel only to be kind. This is from William Shakespeare's Hamlet. Thus bad begins and worse remains behind. In this passage, Shakespeare title character reveals the reasoning behind his plan to kill his stepfather or uncle Claudius. Hamlet states he must be cruel to be kind, which is paradoxical on the surface. However, his apparent cruel act of killing Claudius could be seen as a kindness to Hamlet's mother, who has unknowingly become the wife and lover of her first husband's murderer. In addition, though Hamlet also believes that killing Claudius is bad, he feels the worst will remain behind because his father's death will be avenged. Therefore, though it appears contradictory that Hamlet's murder of a murderer requires cruelty for kindness, there is a level of logic to his reasoning. Next example, As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. I could just remember how my father used to say that the reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. So, how in this sentence, the in this quotation, the use of paradox. This quote is said by Ade Bundrain in Faulkner's novel. She speaks directly to the reader due to the fact that her voice appears in a chapter subsequent to her death. Addie reveals her own paradoxical nature through this paradoxical theory of her father's. If the reason for living is to get ready to stay dead for a long time, then there must be no reason for living since the outcome is death. However, there is an inherent truth in this paradox. particularly in terms of religion. Addy recognizes the futility in the idea that in order to achieve a good life after death, one must live in preparation for death rather than living for life. This adds to the realism and complexity of Addie's character in the novel as she questions the purpose and validity of faith. So, these are the examples of paradox from literature. In the next lecture, we learn about the term realism.